He spoke the future before it happened, and then he vanished. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Let's grow this mystery circle. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I always look forward to reading your thoughts. Let's begin. It was a bleak January morning when the fog crept low over the Thames like a sullen beast, muffling hoofbeats and cloaking the spires of Westminster in a milky shroud. I, Dr. John Watson, had just returned from a most frigid walk and was unbuttoning my overcoat when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door of our Baker Street lodgings with a note folded tightly in her hand and a whisper of confusion in her voice. "It was delivered by a constable, doctor," she said. "Said it was urgent. Said it involved a child." Holmes, who had been languidly sprawled across the settee with a violin tucked beneath his chin, opened one eye. "A child," he echoed, laying the instrument aside with the gentleness of a priest setting down a relic. "Interesting. Bring it here, Watson." I obliged, and he unfolded the note with surgical precision. His eyes skimmed it once, then again, slower. I watched as the pupils narrowed and a faint electric energy returned to his frame. "This," Holmes said, "is no ordinary request. Scotland Yard has sent for us. Lestrade, no less. A boy has been taken from a workhouse near Whitechapel, but not merely taken." He passed me the note. I scanned the lines quickly. From the office of Inspector Lestrade. Urgent. A child named Tobias March, age 9, has vanished from the Holbrook Street workhouse under inexplicable circumstances. Prior to his disappearance, the boy had been uttering predictions, accurate ones, regarding visitors and deaths yet to occur. Rumors abound among the staff and fellow children. A visiting magistrate collapsed dead at the boy's feet this morning. Superstitions now inflame the district. Your counsel is requested immediately. I blinked. Surely this is nonsense. "Nonsense, Watson," Holmes replied, rising and selecting a dark charcoal coat with the speed of a man roused by necessity, "is precisely what drives the world to panic. And panic, when coupled with ignorance, makes for the most fertile ground in which evil may flourish unnoticed." As we descended the stairs, he added, "A boy who read the future aloud and then disappeared. We are either dealing with a dangerously manipulative force or a most curious accident wrapped in superstition. Either way." He paused beneath the gaslight, donning his glove. "This fog is far too quiet for my taste." We arrived at Holbrook Street just past noon. The narrow alley was thick with mist, a curtain that rendered the brick buildings ghostly and the gas lamps like dying stars. A constable waved us through the gates of the workhouse, where Lestrade himself waited on the front step, his hat askew and his expression grim. "Thank God," he said. "Holmes, Watson, you've no idea the trouble brewing here. The press is circling like vultures, and if we don't get a sensible explanation soon, I'll have a riot on my hands." Holmes didn't respond at once. He stepped past Lestrade, eyes sweeping the brickwork, the windows, the broken line of footprints on the thin frost covering the courtyard. "Walk me through it," he said curtly. Lestrade gestured toward the double doors. "This way. The matron and 2 witnesses are waiting." Inside, the workhouse was cold, sour with the smell of cabbage and soap. We were ushered into a dim office where a thin, pinched woman in a black shawl sat clutching a Bible, flanked by a heavy-set cook and a trembling boy of perhaps 12. "Miss Caro," Lestrade said, nodding toward the matron. "She's the one who first brought Tobias to my attention." Holmes stepped forward. "You knew the boy?" Miss Caro's voice trembled. "He came to us just 3 months past. Quiet at first, bright, unusually so. Always reading, always listening. But then, things started to happen." "Such as?" She exchanged a look with the cook, then said, "2 weeks ago, he told Nurse Mary not to take her usual walk through Spitalfields that evening." She laughed. "The next day, we heard she'd been struck by a runaway cart on her route. The boy claimed he'd dreamed it. The cook snorted. And 2 days later, he told me to take the bread out early or it would burn. He looked sheepish. It burned. Holmes raised an eyebrow. You attribute coincidence to foresight. Miss Carrow paled. He said the magistrate would die. That sobered the room. He said it the night before. I heard him. He'll touch the book and fall, Tobias said. And this morning, well, Judge Allerton came to inspect the facilities, and during roll call, he asked Tobias what he had in his hand. Tobias replied, "Only your fate, sir." The judge picked up the Bible from the lectern and she swallowed, collapsed, stone dead. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. Holmes turned to the boy in the corner. "And you?" The child nodded slowly. "I heard him say it too. He said the judge's eyes were clouded with goodbye." "Poetic," Holmes murmured. "What happened after the magistrate fell?" Miss Carrow said, "The room exploded in screams. Tobias just stood there, calm. Then, when we tried to detain him for questioning, he was gone." Lestrade added, "We searched every room, every cupboard, and there's no sign of him. No one saw him leave." Holmes was silent a long moment. Then he strode to the window, examining the sill, the frame. "Watson," he said, "look here." Scrape marks, damp wool fibers. Someone exited through this very window, likely the boy. "Why not through the door?" I asked. "Because panic," Holmes said, "is a splendid distraction for someone with a plan." 10 minutes later, we stood again outside, the fog now so dense it seemed to press upon the chest. Holmes moved along the building's outer wall, following some invisible trail, his eyes low to the cobblestones. Then he stopped abruptly. "What is it?" Lestrade asked. Holmes pointed to a broken bit of chalk lying near the corner of the building, half concealed by debris. "Do you recall, Watson," he said quietly, "the case of the glass lanterns? How the child there left his symbols as breadcrumbs?" I nodded. "You believe this is a message?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that this child wants to be found, but only by someone who thinks in questions, not conclusions." He stood, his eyes gleaming. "We are not chasing a frightened orphan, gentlemen. We are chasing a mind." Holmes crouched beside the fragment of chalk for several moments longer, his gloved fingers brushing over the cobblestones as though they were parchment. He didn't speak, his attention completely absorbed, his breathing almost inaudible. I knew that look. It meant the gears had begun to turn. The sight before him, ordinary to all others, had ignited something. Lestrade shifted from one foot to the other behind us, the fog curling about his coat like smoke. "I don't see the significance," the inspector muttered. "That," Holmes said without lifting his gaze, "is precisely why it is significant." He straightened, brushing his hands together. A single piece of chalk, white, crude, snapped at an angle. "Tell me, Lestrade, have you ever seen a child draw with chalk on pavement and break it with such symmetry?" "Not that I recall." "Of course not. Children grind chalk against stone until it's rounded, frayed at the edges. This," he held it between thumb and forefinger, "was broken deliberately, with a straight pressure. Likely by someone who needed a specific shape, a point, perhaps even a tool." "Tool for what?" I asked. Holmes glanced sideways at me, his eyes glinting. "To leave a mark." He turned on his heel and strode briskly along the perimeter of the building, scanning the foundation's lower edge, boots crunching softly in frost. I followed close behind. He stopped again at the base of the stairs leading to a rear servant's entrance, then dropped to one knee. "Here," he murmured, "beneath the first step. Look closely." I crouched beside him. It took a moment, but then I saw it. Faint lines in the mortar, smudged from time and weather, but unmistakable. An arrow, no larger than a cigarette stub, pointing east. Lestrade summoned with a jerk of Holmes's head, examined it and exhaled. So the boy's been marking his escape route. Perhaps, Holmes said, or perhaps he's marking our entrance. We exchanged a look, and without another word, Holmes descended the steps and knocked once, sharply on the rear door. It was opened by our young scullery maid with ash-blonde hair and soot on her apron. Her eyes widened when she recognized him. "Mr. Holmes, sir, I saw you once in the papers." "Then I hope I lived up to the typeset," Holmes said lightly. "Tell me, have you noticed anything missing from your pantry besides the usual morality?" She blinked. "Pardon?" "Bread, fruit, bits of cheese. Items a clever child might take without drawing attention." The girl hesitated. "Well, yes. Yesterday morning, the basket we'd filled for Sunday orphan's meal, it had a few things gone. I thought one of the boys snuck back." "Good," Holmes said. "That tells me he had time to return once, possibly twice. Did you mention it to anyone?" "No, sir. Figured no one would care." Indeed, the apathy of institutions is remarkably dependable. He turned away from her then, speaking over his shoulder. "Watson, coat?" I handed it to him. He slipped into it without pause and stepped into the alley beyond the gate. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To follow east, naturally. If the boy's planning to be found, he's doing so carefully, choosing paths that reward the observer. This is not flight. It's theater." Lestrade frowned. "You think he wants attention?" "I think," Holmes said as we turned the corner, "that he wants understanding, which is infinitely rarer." The fog had begun to lift ever so slightly, enough for shop fronts to resolve themselves from the murk. Street lamps flickered along the cobblestones, revealing a row of narrow buildings, most of them closed, their shutters tight. But halfway down the lane, tucked between a pawnbroker and a tobacconist, stood a bookshop with windows thick with dust and no signage save for a bronze plate reading "Fitch & Sons, Antiquarian Booksellers." Holmes stopped in front of it. "I had an inkling," he murmured. "Do you remember what Miss Carrow said, Watson?" The boy was always reading. A prodigy, she called him. But where would a child from the workhouse find access to books beyond dog-eared Bibles and catechisms? I studied the storefront. He had a source. "Precisely." Holmes tried the door. It creaked open with a groan of protest. A bell overhead gave a half-hearted jingle. The air within smelled of mildew and leather bindings, and the light was dim, filtered through curtains browned with age. Stacks of books leaned like weary scholars against every wall, and the floor creaked with every step. A tall, cadaverous man in a burgundy waistcoat emerged from behind one of the shelves. "We're closed," he announced without looking at us. "Unless you've come for something specific. We don't carry penny dreadfuls." Holmes moved toward him, removing his gloves. "I rather think you do carry dreadfuls, Mr. Fitch. Though not in print. Tell me, did a boy named Tobias March visit your shop in the past month?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Never heard of him." Holmes smiled. "Let me rephrase. A boy, thin, dark-haired, 9 years old, intelligent beyond his years, likely came during the quiet hours. Would have asked about astronomy, ancient prophecies, perhaps even palmistry. You let him read." For hours, Fitch folded his arms, jaw tight. "This is a respectable establishment. I don't traffic in superstition." "Of course not," Holmes said coolly. "And yet one could argue that the line between myth and scholarship is very thin in some volumes, especially if a child were reading aloud from one of them. Say, for instance, an old translation of Nostradamus." That did it. Fitch's face flickered. Just once. But Holmes saw it. "So he was here," I said. Fitch sighed, dropping the pretense. "He came once a week, Saturday mornings, always polite, always returned books to the same place he found them, never stole, said he wanted to understand the patterns. I assumed he was some poor orphan with delusions of grandeur. But then..." He hesitated. Holmes leaned in. "Then what?" He said something last week that chilled me. Asked me if I believed people could unread the future once it was spoken aloud. I told him time didn't work that way. He nodded and left. Watson frowned. You didn't think that odd? I thought it sad, Fitch replied. Boys like him, they don't last long. Not in Whitechapel. Holmes turned toward the rear of the shop. Do you have a basement? Fitch flinched. You can't go down there. But Holmes was already moving, parting a curtain that revealed a narrow staircase. He descended without waiting. Lestrade and I followed, torches in hand. The basement was small, low-ceilinged and cold. But in one corner, nestled behind crates of forgotten volumes, was a small blanket, and next to it, a leather-bound book cracked with use. Holmes lifted the volume and read the spine aloud. Prognostica. Antiqua. Translations and Theories. He opened it. Pages were marked. Symbols underlined in pencil. This is where he prepared, Holmes said softly. He studied, practiced, and from here, he vanished. Lestrade looked uneasy. You think he's still in the area? I think, Holmes replied, he's watching us. He turned toward a darkened wall and pointed. A second chalk mark, this one shaped like an eye. Gentlemen, Holmes said, stepping back, we are not solving a disappearance. He looked at me, a strange, fierce light in his gaze. We are entering a dialogue. And with that, he closed the book and whispered, let us see what the next sentence says. Holmes did not move from where he stood before the chalk-drawn eye, his silhouette sharp against the dim light that flickered in the corners of the cellar. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint groan of wood above us as someone walked across the floorboards of the bookshop. And I said softly, stepping beside him. So he saw us coming. More than that, Holmes murmured. He anticipated how we would arrive, through intellect, deduction, and the passing of signs. He left us this symbol not only as a confirmation of his presence, but as a signal that we are, from here on, part of his puzzle. He is watching and guiding. Lestrade's brow furrowed. But where is he guiding us to? And why? Holmes ran a fingertip over the chalk lines, then turned his attention to the crates beside the blanket. He crouched, shifting them gently, examining the space for hidden compartments or objects. After a moment, he withdrew a small folded paper from between the boards. He held it up carefully, unfolding it with a precision that seemed ceremonial. The paper was yellowed but intact, and on its surface was a single phrase written in a child's careful hand. He who reads must be heard. Holmes passed it to me. I read the line again and looked up. It's a message, I said, but cryptic. He's quoting something? Perhaps, Holmes replied, or issuing a rule. Either way, it implies something beyond mere cleverness. It implies performance. The boy's so-called predictions, the ones reported by the matron, were not simply visions. They were meant to be heard, not kept silent. There's ritual in that. Lestrade snorted. Are we chasing a conjurer or a runaway? We're chasing a mind that understands the power of belief, Holmes answered, and is willing to wield it with surgical precision. He stood and walked slowly around the basement, pausing at a stack of thin pamphlets scattered on a low table. He picked one up and raised an eyebrow. Watson, look at this. I took the pamphlet from him. The title read, Society of Symbolic Voices. Public Lecture, Friday 7:30 p.m., Hawthorne Chapel, Shoreditch. Lestrade read over my shoulder. That's tonight, Holmes nodded. Precisely. And look at the marginalia. He showed us the back of the pamphlet. Scribbled in the pencil were 3 numbers, 7.31, 9.14, 11.00. Watson said, Times? I doubt it. Too symmetrical. Possibly page numbers, possibly verses. But the relevance is clear. The boy planned this. He left this behind with purpose. Lestrade gave a sharp breath. You think he'll be there? Holmes smiled faintly. If he is half as clever as he wants us to believe. He already is. We left the bookshop in silence, the weight of the boy's trail pressing on all of us. Outside, the fog had thinned, but the cold was keener. London was beginning to light its lamps, and a hush was descending over the streets as workers trudged home and carriages rolled slowly through the mist. As we walked toward Baker Street to retrieve Holmes's disguise kit, he explained his theory with that calm, almost clinical tone he reserved for the most curious of cases. Tobias March is not merely running, he said. He is orchestrating. Each clue he's left has been deliberate, calculated. And what fascinates me most is the duality of it. He hides, but not completely. He speaks, but in riddles. He wants to remain hidden while being found. That's a contradiction, I said. Indeed, which makes it human and strategic. He paused. There is a distinct possibility, Watson, that we are dealing with more than one child. I stopped in my tracks. More than one? Look at the logistics. A disappearing act from a crowded room. Clues placed across the city. Symbols at precise intervals. Either he has assistance, or he is using the belief of others to move invisibly through the world. Lestrade frowned. You mean he's hiding in plain sight? Precisely. The question is, what role is he playing when he does? Back at Baker Street, Holmes retrieved a battered leather satchel from the cabinet above the fireplace. Within were false beards, round spectacles, soot-darkening powder, and a long overcoat of coarse wool that added a decade to his appearance and removed a stone of weight from his frame. He dressed swiftly, transforming before my eyes, from the brilliant consulting detective into a stooped bookseller with ink-stained fingers and an uneven gait. If the Society of Symbolic Voices holds a meeting tonight, he said, fitting a slight cork insert into his lower jaw to widen the shape of his face, then it is the perfect place for a child like Tobias to disappear into. Crowds, chaos, expectation. If he reads the future aloud, as the phrase suggests, he'll need an audience. Lestrade remained in plain clothes, but with his badge pocketed. I wore a dark overcoat and a scarf drawn high to my chin. We would pose as scholars or observers, curious inquirers. Nothing more. The Hawthorne Chapel stood on a quiet street, its entrance flanked by crumbling gargoyles and a rusted iron fence. It had the look of a place forgotten by time. Stained glass dulled by soot, its steeple leaning as if weary of judgment. A painted sign outside confirmed the evening's lecture, the voice as portal, symbolism in sound and sight. Inside, a modest crowd of 20 or so had gathered in worn wooden pews. At the front stood a makeshift lectern and a row of chairs. Candles provided flickering illumination, and the atmosphere was more cultic than academic. A man in a long navy coat stood at the lectern, preparing papers. Others milled about, murmuring. The air smelled of old wood, candle wax, and damp wool. Holmes chose a seat 3 rows from the front. I took the one beside him. Lestrade sat behind. The room settled. The lecturer began, introducing himself as Professor Alan Marr, an independent investigator of sound and semiotics. He spoke of ancient tongues, the rhythm of prophecy, and the sacred geometry of vocal vibration. The language was academic, but the audience seemed entranced. And then, just before the hour turned, the back door of the chapel opened silently. A figure entered. Small, hooded. He moved with quiet purpose, slipping along the aisle's edge until he reached a side platform where a smaller lectern had been placed. He mounted the steps and stood facing the crowd, still hooded. The professor paused mid-sentence and, after a brief glance to his left, gave a slight nod and stepped aside. It was Tobias. He pulled back the hood. The hush in the room was complete. Holmes did not move. His disguise was impeccable, but I felt the tension beneath his stillness. Tobias opened the worn book he carried, the Prognostica Antiqua. His voice was quiet, and yet somehow it carried. When the eye is drawn but not seen, When the bell is rung, but does not chime, then shall the watcher step beyond time. No one spoke. He continued, his tone calm, almost hypnotic. The boy with the eye in his hand will read what no man dares write. The watchers will find him, only if they listen to what is not spoken. Then, just as suddenly, he closed the book and walked away. Holmes rose at once, motioning for me and Lestrade to follow. We reached the hallway, but he was already gone. Gone again. Not through the front. Not toward the street, but somewhere else. Holmes turned, his eyes bright and hungry. He's pulling us further in. The message tonight was meant for us, not the audience. What does it mean? I asked breathlessly. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then he whispered, "It means the game is no longer between us and a runaway." He paused. "It's between us and someone who wants to be believed more than he wants to be free." And then we ran. We chased the echo of the boy's footsteps through the chapel's stone corridors, the flickering light from wall sconces stretching our shadows ahead like phantoms. The silence was not empty. It pulsed with tension, with the unmistakable sense of being led rather than pursuing. Holmes was swift but measured, his eyes scanning every doorframe, every recess of the hallway, as though the child's intentions were scrawled on the walls. "Quick!" he hissed, pausing beside a narrow archway leading to a descending spiral of stone steps. "He's gone below." I followed him into the stairwell, the chill deepening with each turn. Behind us, Lestrade's boots thudded heavily against the stone, and I feared the sound alone would alert the boy, if he hadn't already accounted for it. The stair gave out into a crypt-like cellar, larger than I expected, with vaulted ceilings and a maze of half-fallen columns. Candles flickered low in alcoves, as though the place had been used for other gatherings, quiet ones, unsanctioned. At the far end stood a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. Holmes approached with the caution of a man approaching a wounded animal. Beyond the door lay a small chamber lined with shelves of dusty manuscripts, old astronomical charts, and brass instruments left to tarnish in peace. A single lantern hung from a nail, burning low. In the center of the room sat a small wooden chair, and on the chair a bundle. Holmes approached. It was Tobias's coat, laid out deliberately, the sleeves crossed neatly. On top of it, a brass medallion engraved with concentric circles and a series of ancient-looking letters. Beside it, another folded slip of paper. Holmes opened it slowly. "To be believed, I must be doubted. To be followed, I must disappear. The truth waits not behind me, but beside you." Holmes stared at the note for several seconds. Then he turned sharply to Lestrade. "Did anyone check the audience during the reading?" "What do you mean?" "I mean," Holmes snapped, "did anyone watch the watchers?" Lestrade shook his head. "We were focused on the boy." "As he intended." Holmes swore under his breath. "We assumed that because the boy stood before us, the message came from him. But what if the speaker was the bait and the real Tobias was in the crowd?" I finished. Holmes nodded, already moving back toward the stairs. "We need to speak with the professor," he said. "Ma, if anyone interacted with the boy before or after the reading, it was him." We found the professor outside the chapel, his long coat drawn tight against the wind, pipe clenched between his teeth. He startled when he saw Holmes, now minus his disguise, and dropped the pipe. "Mr. Holmes, I hadn't expected—" "No doubt," Holmes said briskly. "The boy, Tobias. How was he introduced to you?" Ma blinked. "He wasn't. He arrived an hour before the event, said he had a message to deliver, and handed me a sealed note." "You still have it?" He pulled a paper from his coat pocket and handed it over. Holmes opened it, and I read over his shoulder. "Allow the boy 5 minutes. He will read. Do not question him. If you interrupt, the message is lost." Ma looked shaken. I followed the instructions. I assumed it was arranged through one of the society's sponsors. We have mystics, readers, performers who come and go. Did he speak to anyone before the event? Any contact at all? Ma shook his head. None. He kept to himself. Read the book quietly, didn't respond to questions, but he seemed calm. Poised even. Did he enter alone? Holmes asked sharply. The professor paused, brows knitting. Yes, I think so. Although, now that you mention it, just before he arrived, a man was leaving the vestry. I assumed he was staff. What did he look like? Tall, wrapped in a grey scarf and cap. I didn't see his face. Holmes gave a curt nod and turned away. We've been focusing too narrowly on the boy himself. There's a pattern here. Symbols, phrases, appearances at precise times. This is not the work of a child operating alone. Lestrade grunted. So someone's directing him, or sheltering him, perhaps even using him. Holmes was quiet for a moment, then said, We must return to the workhouse. I need to know more about Tobias's background, especially the days before his arrival. And Watson, bring the medallion. By the time we reached Holbrook Street again, the night had deepened, and the wind carried a hard chill. Inside, Miss Carrow greeted us at the door, looking wearier than before. I feared you'd be back, she said, ushering us toward the office. No news of him. In a manner of speaking, Holmes replied, and handed her the folded coat. Is this his? She nodded slowly. Yes, he never went without it. Tell me, Miss Carrow, Holmes said, settling into a hard-backed chair. Was there anything peculiar about the way Tobias came to you? Any note, sponsor, or unusual circumstance? She folded her arms. He arrived alone. That's not uncommon. They leave the poor houses, the streets, sometimes worse. He had bruises, old ones, and wouldn't say where he'd come from, but he carried a book in his satchel, a small red one. Which book? Gone now, disappeared when he did. But I remember the title, The Voice and the Veil. Some religious text, I assumed. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did anyone ever visit him? Only once. A man in a grey scarf. Lestrade and I locked eyes. Do you remember the date? Holmes asked. 3 nights before the judge collapsed. I thought he was from the parish. He asked to speak with Tobias alone. I said no, of course. But he managed to catch him afterward during supper. 5 minutes, no more. What happened after? I asked. Tobias didn't speak for a full day. Holmes stood. Watson, the medallion. I handed it to him, and he passed it to Miss Carrow. Have you ever seen this before? She took it, squinting in the lamplight. Her eyes widened slightly. One of the children found something like this months ago, buried behind the chapel in the east yard. A small tin of odd items. Chalk, string, this kind of coin. I thought it was a game. The tin vanished after a week. Holmes paced slowly. That settles it. We're dealing with a society of sorts. Ritualistic, secretive, embedded among the fringes of mysticism and scholarship, and Tobias, for reasons still unclear, was selected or groomed to act as a vessel. For what? Lestrade asked. Some prophecy nonsense? For the projection of belief, Holmes replied, to control others through symbolic authority. The child becomes the oracle. People interpret what he says however they choose, and those who direct the oracle remain invisible. He turned toward the window, silent a long while. We've been looking at this as a case of disappearance, he said finally. But what if it's a performance of disappearance? A constructed vanishing meant to strengthen his myth? Then what's the next act? I asked. Holmes looked at me. He reappears. He tapped his fingers against the sill, then looked at Lestrade. I want a list of every underground society, spiritualist circle, or esoteric gathering in London that's meeting within the next 48 hours. Lestrade blinked. That's hundreds. Start with any that mention prophecy, sound, or symbolic acts. He will surface again, but not as a child, as something more. He turned to me and spoke in a low voice. When belief becomes currency, Watson, then even a boy can become a god. The following morning broke grey and low-hanging. The sky stretched taut like damp canvas across the rooftops of London. I rose early to the soft rustle of Holmes already moving about the sitting room. Books open, maps unfurled, newspaper clippings clipped and spread across the table like evidence on a mortuary slab. The air smelled faintly of toast and ink. I found him standing before the fireplace, gaze fixed on the flames but clearly seeing something far beyond them. "You haven't slept," I said. "I have," he replied absently. "In short, efficient doses between revelations." He motioned for me to sit. "We are dealing with an organization, or more accurately, a network, that uses performance and symbolism as tools of influence. Tobias is the centerpiece, but not the architect. There's a pattern emerging in the timing of his appearances." I rubbed my eyes. "Go on." He gestured to a chalkboard he'd filled in his crabbed, swift script. "Each event involving Tobias has occurred at precisely spaced intervals. 5 days between the bread warning and Nurse Mary's accident. 4 days to the magistrate's death. 3 days to the chapel reading. If we assume this decreasing sequence continues, then the next event is tonight." Holmes nodded. "And it will be the most elaborate thus far. A culmination. The culmination, perhaps." "Have we found where?" "Possibly. Lestrade sent over a list of scheduled gatherings from Scotland Yard's surveillance ledger. Only one matches our criteria for tonight. A private salon hosted by the Society for the Mythopoetic Voice. The name alone sounds guilty." "Indeed," Holmes said. "They are staging a performance titled The Silence That Speaks in a private hall on Mercer's Row. Invitation only, limited to 40 attendees, many from London's elite artistic and occult circles." "Do we have a way in?" Holmes smiled thinly. "We do now. I took the liberty of borrowing a pair of engraved invitations from a rather sleepy bookseller named Mr. Arliss, who attended last year's gathering but no longer has the stomach for such affairs. We shall go tonight as him and his associate, Dr. Bennett." "Does that make me the doctor?" "You're always the doctor, Watson. I am for tonight a curious dilettante with more curiosity than social grace." He passed me one of the invitations. The cardstock was thick, embossed with a silver sigil, a spiral with a single vertical slash through it. Beneath it, in calligraphic script, were the words, "Those who hear shall be shown." That afternoon passed in tense preparation. Holmes was particular about our attire. No overt elegance, nothing that would suggest scrutiny or officialdom. He powdered his hair slightly at the temples, giving himself the air of a disillusioned scholar, and selected wire-rimmed spectacles to dull the sharpness of his gaze. I, in turn, wore a conservative coat and a cravat knotted in the indifferent fashion of men more interested in ideas than appearances. The hall on Mercer's Row was an unmarked Georgian structure between 2 shuttered storefronts, its windows curtained from within and a single iron lantern glowing above the door. At the entrance, a doorman in an ivory waistcoat checked our invitations with a brief glance and nodded us inside. The interior was candlelit and narrow, with walls lined in dark velvet and floors covered in Persian rugs dulled by years of footfall. We were ushered into a drawing room where a small crowd had already gathered. Artists with ink-stained fingers, women in violet gowns and lace veils, a man in ecclesiastical garb sipping red wine and murmuring about harmonic echoes. Holmes, adopting a subtle hunch in his posture, leaned toward me. "Observe them, each here for a different reason: art, power, escape, but all united by one belief, that hidden truths can be accessed through sound. And they think Tobias is the key? They will, if they don't already." A bell rang softly. Doors at the rear of the room were opened by a man in a dove-grey cloak, and the guests filed through in reverent silence. We entered a dimly lit hall, its ceiling arched high with wood beams, a semicircle of chairs arranged before a low platform. At the center stood a tall glass screen behind which flickered the distorted glow of candlelight. We took our seats near the back. Holmes leaned slightly forward, watching everything and everyone. A hush fell. The man in the cloak stepped forward. "Tonight," he said in a clear, resonant voice, "we gather to receive what has been heard by one untouched by pretense, one who speaks what he cannot fully understand, yet what we must." He stepped aside. From behind the screen came a faint tapping, then the soft pad of bare feet. A figure approached, a silhouette behind the frosted glass. The voice that followed was unmistakable. "Tobias." When the bell is heard 3 times but not rung, when the candle burns without wick or wax, then shall the hour of choice fall silent. Gasps rippled through the room. The audience leaned forward, breathless. "Do not look for me where I was," Tobias intoned, "for I have become the silence between questions." I looked to Holmes. He was still, lips pressed tight, his eyes scanning the outline behind the screen. He leaned toward me and whispered, "Listen to the rhythm of his voice. It's slower, more deliberate. He's reading, but not freely." "You think he's being controlled?" "I think," Holmes replied, "he is not alone behind that screen." Tobias continued. 3 truths. 1 spoken, 1 buried, 1 borrowed. I speak now the borrowed truth, that which was taken from another's silence. Suddenly, the screen flickered from behind. A second shadow moved. Holmes stood. "Stay here," he whispered. "If I'm right, the real Tobias may be elsewhere entirely. This boy is repeating a script." He moved through the side aisle, quiet as breath, slipping through a concealed side curtain near the platform. I remained seated, heart pounding, watching the shadows flicker as the figure continued its eerie litany. Seconds later, I heard a faint shout. Gasps rose from the audience. The screen swayed, then fell backward, shattering with a crash. There was no one behind it, just a phonograph. Still spinning, needle trembling on the final groove of the record. A woman screamed. Guests surged from their seats, confused and panicked. And then Holmes reappeared, gripping the arm of a pale, dirt-smudged boy who blinked against the light. Tobias March, the real one. Holmes raised his voice over the din. He was hidden beneath the stage. "Drugged. The voice you heard was a recording." Lestrade appeared at the rear entrance, trailed by 2 constables. The cloaked man tried to flee. Lestrade blocked him. Within minutes, the room was chaos. Holmes guided Tobias into a chair, covering him with his coat. I knelt beside him. "Tobias, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. They said I had to read. If I stopped, the others would disappear." "You're safe now," I said. "We found you." Holmes turned to the crowd, now silent with shock. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been made witnesses to a fraud perpetuated with precision and cruelty." The mythopoetic voice was not a gift. It was a lie, manufactured to manipulate your belief and direct your admiration toward those who remained hidden. He turned back to Tobias, his voice gentler. "But he spoke truly once. He said the truth waits not behind, but beside." And here, Holmes looked at me, then at Lestrade, is where we stand now. Tobias gripped Holmes' hand, and for the first time, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Tobias's fingers were cold in Holmes's hand, his small knuckles pale and bruised. The boy blinked as if surfacing from a long, submerged sleep. Around us, the room remained hushed, the aftermath of the spectacle settling like dust on the shoulders of the disoriented guests. The phonograph still whirred faintly behind the wreckage of the fallen screen, the needle skipping on the final groove like a heart trapped in repetition. Lestrade moved in quickly with the constables, securing the man in the dove-grey cloak, now stripped of all ceremonial mystique and revealed to be a Mr. Barnaby Hexton, former stage manager and known associate of several fringe occultist circles. His face was blotched with sweat and fury as he struggled in Lestrade's grip. "You fools don't understand," Hexton snarled. "The boy is a vessel. He doesn't belong to you." Holmes gave him a withering glance. "On the contrary, the boy belongs to no one, least of all to those who place him behind curtains and teach him to speak in riddles they themselves barely understand." Hexton laughed bitterly. "You think this ends with me? You think you've stopped something? There are others. This was only a fragment of the rite." Holmes turned away from him without another word. We helped Tobias to his feet slowly. His legs trembled beneath him, but he stayed upright, eyes scanning the space with cautious bewilderment. Where is the man with the book?" he asked softly. Holmes knelt beside him. "You'll need to be more specific." Tobias hesitated. He never told me his name, only said that I had the voice and he had the words. He gave me books, told me what to say, said people needed to believe something, because otherwise they'd look too closely. Holmes's brow tightened. "And did he ever threaten you?" Tobias nodded. "Not with words, just with looks. Sometimes he'd hold my wrist and not let go. He said if I didn't read, they'd forget me, that I'd be nobody again." Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose. "That," he said, "is the oldest manipulation of all, tying purpose to obedience." He looked to Lestrade. "Get Hexton out of here, quietly. The others, let them go. This crowd will do our work for us. They'll talk, spin tales, point fingers. Somewhere in that chatter, the truth will surface again." Lestrade nodded and began to organize the dispersal. As the guests filed out, many staring openly at Tobias, some whispering, Holmes drew me aside. He mentioned someone else. The man with the book. "Yes. You think it's the same figure, the one with the grey scarf?" "Undoubtedly. We've seen this man's shadow, but never his face. He moves through institutions like a ghost, dropping messages, orchestrating scenes, a master of indirect influence. But now that we've interrupted the ritual, he'll change tactics." "You believe he'll come for the boy?" Holmes shook his head. "Number, he'll disappear further. Someone like that doesn't reclaim pawns once they're exposed. He'll begin grooming the next one. Tobias was never the end. Merely a prototype." Tobias, still clutching Holmes's coat around him, tugged lightly at his sleeve. "Will I have to go back to the workhouse?" Holmes looked down at him, then at me. "Not tonight, and not while we can help it." We brought him back to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, ever unflappable, gave one look at the boy and promptly declared that the guest room must be made up at once. Tobias said little as she fed him broth and placed warm socks on his feet, but his eyes remained wide and alert, tracking every movement as though still unsure whether any of this was real. Later, Holmes and I sat in the study, the fireplace glowing, and Tobias asleep in the next room, curled up like a question mark in the heavy blankets. Holmes stood with his back to the fire, hands clasped behind him, pacing with slow deliberation. "This case," he said, "has less to do with crime in the traditional sense and more to do with belief, how it is planted, shaped, and harvested. That is what makes it dangerous." Tobias was not forced to commit a criminal act, but was instead used as a conduit to manipulate others into giving up their reason. I nodded slowly. It was almost religious, the way they listened to him. "Yes, because once you grant someone prophetic authority, you stop evaluating their words for sense or fact. You begin interpreting them as signs." He paused. "But in doing so, you surrender your own agency. That, Watson, is the real theft here. Not the boy's freedom, but the minds of those who believed him." "And the man behind it all?" I asked. Holmes turned and faced me. We've met his methods, not his name, but we have a trail now. Hexton will speak, and Tobias has seen more than he realizes. Somewhere in the fog of this deception, a pattern will emerge. And once we find that pattern, his voice hardened slightly, we find him. That night I stayed up longer than I intended, writing my notes by lamplight, occasionally checking in on the sleeping boy. He murmured once in his sleep, something about a candle that burns without fire, and then fell silent again. Holmes did not sleep. He read page after page of obscure journals, pamphlets, records of minor cults and defunct societies, hunting for the symbol embossed on our stolen invitation, the spiral with the vertical slash. And just before dawn, as grey light began to filter through the curtains, I heard him utter a soft sound of satisfaction. I rose and crossed to his desk. He pointed to a passage in an old volume titled Symbolic Traditions of the Urban Fringe. There, he said, the mark is known as the Spiral of Remembrance, used by a short-lived group in Paris during the 1860s, La Voix Dormante. The sleeping voice. They believed children were vessels for pre-human knowledge and staged readings similar to what we witnessed. They vanished. Quite literally. Police found empty stages, locked rooms, no trace of the children used. Only pamphlets left behind. And now, it's here. Rebranded, redressed, but unmistakable. He shut the book and looked out the window. Watson, someone is rebuilding an old machine, and Tobias was simply the first gear to turn. I felt the weight of that thought settle into the silence between us. Holmes lit a cigarette and said nothing more, but I knew from the set of his jaw that he would not let this trail go cold. Not now, not ever. By midday, the storm of the night before had passed into rumor. The society's gathering had become whispered gossip in clubs and cafes across the city, distorted with every telling. Some claimed the boy had vanished into mist, others swore he levitated. But Holmes, impervious to such fanciful distortions, remained wholly fixated on the only truth that mattered to him, the identity of the architect behind it all. Tobias remained at Baker Street, quieter now, but steadier. Mrs. Hudson had taken to him with maternal resolve, and I found myself surprised by the way the boy had begun to look to Holmes, not with awe, as most did, but with something more like wary curiosity. There was no hero worship in the boy's eyes, just the recognition of someone who also lived inside his mind more than outside it. Holmes, meanwhile, scarcely spoke during the morning, absorbed in organizing the fragments. He was charting, quite literally, a constellation of symbols and phrases, drawing connections between the spiral of remembrance and its known offshoots. I knew better than to interrupt his rhythm, but after an hour of silent deduction, broken only by the scratch of pencil and the occasional exhale, I ventured, "Do you believe the group is operating internationally?" Holmes didn't look up. Without question, Paris in the 1860s, Istanbul in 73, Madrid 10 years later, always the same pattern, a child of unusual expression, a surge in belief, a vanishing, and then silence. They resurface only when the memory has faded, wearing a new name and mask. He pointed to one of the lines connecting cities. The spiral is not a fixed structure. It grows by forgetting what came before. The fewer who remember the last performance, the more effective the next. I glanced toward the hearth where Tobias sat curled with a book, the flickering light reflecting off his hair. He was meant to vanish, wasn't he? Forever. Holmes nodded. His reappearance was not part of the plan. That is why they fled, why the phonograph was used. They had already begun preparing the next act. The machine was moving forward. There was a knock at the door. Holmes stiffened slightly. Mrs. Hudson appeared. "Inspector Lestrade, sir." Lestrade entered, trench coat damp with London drizzle, a manila envelope tucked beneath his arm. His expression was uncharacteristically subdued. "We questioned Hexton all night," he said. "He gave us names, locations, all fake or abandoned. But he did confirm what you suspected. He was not the designer, only the stagehand." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he mention a name?" "Only once. He referred to him as the cartographer. Said he never saw the man's full face, only that he wore gloves and spoke very little. Said he always arrived with something written. Never improvised, never deviated." Holmes stood abruptly and crossed to the map he'd pinned to the wall. "A cartographer," he murmured. "Not a prophet, not a priest, a map maker. That tells us everything." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "It tells me nothing." "It tells me," Holmes said, eyes brightening, "that we're not chasing someone obsessed with mystery for its own sake. We're chasing a planner, a designer, someone who charts influence like territory and moves belief through society the way one might draft an invasion." He jabbed a finger at the points on the map. "Each child used, each message delivered, each ritual performed. Not random, not theatrical nonsense. Tactical positioning. He plants symbols like flags. He speaks through others so he cannot be traced, and he builds nothing that cannot be abandoned." Lestrade crossed the room and handed Holmes the envelope. "You may find this relevant. It's a recovered letter, intercepted through the Postal Screening Division. Originated in Whitechapel, addressed to a now-defunct publishing house in Prague. No return name, but the language caught the clerk's eye." Holmes slit the envelope open with a penknife. Inside was a single sheet, typed, "The boy is no longer viable. The vessel cracked before the final echo. Prepare the substitute. Instructions will arrive with the next tide." Holmes read it aloud, then fell silent. Lestrade muttered, "Cold." Holmes folded the letter carefully and placed it on the mantel. "It confirms our suspicion. Tobias was one chapter in a longer manuscript." He turned to me. "Do you recall what Tobias said? The man with the book told him he had the voice, but not the words. That is the heart of it. The children are merely the megaphones. The real voice belongs to the one writing the words." "And you think the next vessel is already chosen?" "Likely." Tobias, who had been quietly listening from the hearth, looked up now. "I saw her," he said. Holmes turned to him at once. "Her?" The boy nodded. "A girl, only once, before the chapel. The man in the grey scarf brought her with him. She had dark hair and sat beside him on a bench behind the bookshop. She didn't speak, but she held a notebook." Holmes knelt beside him. "Do you remember anything else?" Tobias frowned. "She had something on her wrist, like a mark. A small spiral, like the ones in the papers. Drawn in ink." Holmes stood and paced in a tight circle. "They are grooming her now. Preparing her. Which means—" He paused mid-step. "We have less than 48 hours before the next emergence. Perhaps less." Lestrade looked alarmed. "You expect another gathering?" "I expect another performance, but not necessarily in a public hall. That would be too predictable after the last failure. No, this time they'll go small, exclusive, intimate. The belief must be focused, which means the audience will be chosen." He tapped his temple. "We need to find those who are not at Mercer's Row, those known sympathizers of these societies who are absent. That's where the next thread lies." Lestrade nodded slowly. "I'll get to work." After the inspector left, Holmes returned to his desk, rifling through the stack of guest lists we had already gathered. I remained by the fire, where Tobias now rested against the armchair, half asleep. Holmes worked until evening, until the gaslights came on and the city turned silver under rain. Then suddenly, he stopped. "Watson." I looked up. "Do you recall the name Professor Wilton?" "Yes, vaguely. From the lecture circuit. An old Orientalist at King's College, wasn't he?" He was. Until his quiet dismissal last autumn, for what the university called undue philosophical influence on students. He vanished after that. But he was also a known attendee of La Voix Dormante gatherings in Paris. Holmes held up a folded invitation card, one not from Mercer's Row, but from a private estate. The Marchmont Foundation is hosting an invitation-only salon tomorrow evening. Theme, The Children of Babel, Language Beyond the Mind. "Good Lord," I murmured. "That's it." Holmes smiled faintly. "It will be. And this time, we do not merely observe." He looked over at Tobias, who slept with his chin tucked to his chest, his small hands curled as if still protecting something invisible. "This time," Holmes said quietly, "we speak." The Marchmont Foundation was one of those institutions that existed almost entirely within the hush of privilege, never advertised, never challenged, and never quite confirmed. It occupied a 4-story townhouse tucked discreetly between a solicitor's office and a perfumery on the western end of Grafton Street. Its windows were perpetually shuttered, its brass plaque tarnished by design, and its doors opened only to those whose names preceded them like keys. Holmes had arranged our entrance by midday. The process had involved 3 telegrams, a carefully forged letter of introduction from a fictitious professor of linguistic anthropology, and the strategic mention of an acquaintance known to the salon's hostess. One, Lady Yvonne Talwick, whose curiosity in the esoteric was rivaled only by her discretion. By dusk, we had received the reply, "You are expected. Do bring something to share." As we dressed that evening, Holmes in a tailored but understated grey suit, I in a black dinner coat more severe than usual, I found myself unusually tense. "We're not merely attending this time," I said, watching Holmes knot his cravat. "We're placing ourselves within the frame." Holmes gave a slight nod without breaking stride. "Quite so. They will be expecting obedience, curiosity, perhaps even awe. We must give them exactly what they want." He looked over at me, "and then take everything they try to hide." We arrived just before 8. The footman at the door took our names from a list without speaking and led us through a warm vestibule into a high-ceilinged drawing room dimly lit by crystal sconces. The scent of old parchment and sandalwood hung in the air. A dozen guests had already arrived, milling about with wine glasses and murmured anticipation. But there was no stage, no lectern, no signal of an event to begin, only waiting. Holmes's eyes scanned the room with practiced subtlety. "Notice anything?" I followed his gaze. "Yes, there are no servants." "Exactly, and no staff visible beyond the footman. That tells me the event tonight is not a performance. It's a ritual, one conducted in silence, behind thresholds, and likely with only a portion of this room invited to observe it." He moved with the grace of a man entirely at ease, drifting toward a bookcase as if in idle curiosity, listening as he passed. I mirrored him, approaching a small knot of guests gathered near a sideboard. Their conversation, though low, was unmistakably rehearsed. "She's fluent in Proto-Uralic," one man was saying. "Self-taught by the age of 9. A pity it isn't the language she dreams in," another woman replied, swirling her wine. "Those are the tongues that matter." At the edge of the room, a door opened without ceremony, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped into view. He wore a charcoal jacket and a scholar's indifference. The room quieted subtly. No one turned to look, but everyone stilled, like birds sensing weather. "Professor Wilton." Holmes reached me a second later. "Confirmed," he whispered. "That's him. And the girl is here." I caught a glimpse through the mirror over the mantel. She was led down the back stairs 5 minutes ago. "What do we do?" "We wait for the room to fracture." Wilton crossed to a marble-topped console table where a delicate brass bell rested. He rang it once, softly. The sound barely rose above a whisper, and yet it echoed through the room with unnatural clarity. 9 guests stepped forward. No more, no fewer. Wilton inclined his head. "We will begin now. The rest of you may remain and listen." The 9 disappeared with him through the far door, which clicked shut behind them. Holmes leaned toward me. "Now, Watson, come." He moved swiftly, silently, bypassing the rear of the room and through a concealed doorway just off the main hall, one he had marked earlier when observing the servants' path. We descended a narrow staircase, cloaked in shadow, until the sounds of footsteps and hushed breath began to rise from somewhere ahead. We reached a small gallery overlooking a lower chamber, the interior revealed through a gap in the carved wooden screen. Below, the 9 guests stood in a semicircle around a girl no older than 11. She stood barefoot on a patterned rug, dark hair falling across her shoulders. Her hands were folded before her. Her eyes were closed. A spiral had been inked onto her palm, and beside her stood Wilton, holding a thin book bound in leather. The moment he opened it, the room's attention snapped inward like a spring. He did not speak from it, but instead held it toward the girl. She opened her mouth, but the voice that emerged did not sound like a child's. It was deeper, measured, as though trained by repetition to speak at a pitch not her own. "When the tongue is divided," she said, "and the voice forgets itself, the shape of knowing may return." Holmes whispered, "They've trained her in cadence." Likely through a combination of phonetic mimicry and isolation. "What is the purpose?" "To convince the listeners that something ancient is returning," she continued, the lines sounding more like invocation than insight. "When the name of the watcher is spoken thrice, and silence breaks beneath the skin, then shall the architect rise unseen." The 9 guests remained still, heads slightly bowed. And then Wilton stepped forward. He took the girl's hands, lifted them outward. She kept speaking, but her eyes opened, and she looked straight toward the screen behind which we hid. Not vaguely, not unconsciously, directly. Holmes did not move. She did not stop. But Wilton had seen it. He turned sharply. Holmes stepped from the shadow. "Professor," he said calmly, "you might have anticipated the spiral would eventually turn back to its origin." Gasps below. The girl froze. Wilton's voice remained steady. "Mr. Holmes, I had hoped your interest would remain philosophical." "My interest," Holmes replied, "ends when children are manipulated into pantomimes of prophecy." Wilton stepped away from the girl. "This is not manipulation. It is restoration. She speaks what lies beneath all language." Holmes interrupted him. "She speaks what you've trained her to repeat, like the boy before her." Tobias March. That name rippled through the room. Wilton's eyes narrowed. He was unprepared. He lacked discipline. He was frightened by the role. "He was 9, I said, stepping beside Holmes, "and drugged, and told he would be forgotten unless he obeyed." Wilton glanced at the girl. "And yet here she is. Clear, certain, until the next one," Holmes said. "Until she cracks beneath your expectations and you burn the fragments behind a curtain while the phonograph plays." Holmes turned to the 9. "How long before you admit it? That you are being used? That each so-called oracle leaves no trace because it must be buried for the next to shine?" The guests shifted. A few took a step back. One woman removed her spectacles. Wilton said nothing. The girl now stared down at her inked hands. The voice had gone. Holmes moved to her gently. "You may stop now," he said. "No one will vanish if you do." She looked up at him, and for the first time she nodded. The silence that followed was heavy, but not sacred, not electric, only real. Lestrade arrived minutes later, summoned by Holmes in advance. Wilton was taken into custody. The girl, whose name was Anna, was brought to Baker Street under temporary guardianship. Holmes filed a report that omitted names, but preserved every method, every manipulation, every deception. It would circulate through quiet channels, enough to dim the next performance before it could begin. And that night, for the first time since the boy had arrived, Holmes sat beside the fire and said nothing at all. He only stared at the faint spiral drawn in chalk on the hearthstone by Tobias. Then he reached out slowly and wiped it away. By the following morning, the skies above Baker Street had turned a colorless gray, the kind of dull, featureless expanse that made the city feel suspended in a moment between seasons. The air was still, and even the sparrows seemed to pause on the windowsills, sensing something just beneath the surface of the ordinary. Tobias sat at the small table beside the fire, slowly turning the pages of a worn copy of the Jungle Book. Aina, the girl rescued from the Marchmont cellar, remained silent in the corner armchair, her legs tucked beneath her and a cup of tea cooling in her hand. Her spiral mark had been scrubbed from her palm, but she rubbed at the skin absently, as if trying to erase the memory more than the ink. Holmes, standing by the window, had scarcely moved in over an hour. His arms were folded behind his back, his gaze unfocused but penetrating, reading patterns not in books but in silence. "They'll deny everything," I said eventually, breaking the hush. "Of course," Holmes replied, voice low and remote. "Wilton will claim academic abstraction, the guests will say it was all metaphor, and the girl will be called an unfortunate case of misinterpreted theatre." He turned, eyes sharper now. "But we disrupted their sequence. That's what matters. We exposed the core of the mechanism, and now the outer wheels will seize. For a time, you believe they'll rebuild. In some form, inevitably. Belief systems built on mystery rarely dissolve. They evolve. But the veil has been torn, Watson, and it was never mystery they relied on. It was obedience." He walked to the desk and opened the drawer where he'd placed the intercepted letter. "The boy is no longer viable." Reading it again with quiet scrutiny. "They planned the replacement before Tobias ever spoke at the chapel. The spiral turns, as I said, but what we've interrupted is the rhythm, the expected cadence. The cartographer, whoever he is, will have lost a step." I sat across from him. "And you believe that will draw him out?" Holmes nodded once. "He is not the sort to retreat completely. He works in shadows, yes, but he builds through structure. If his design is disrupted, he will move to preserve its shape." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a small silver tray. "This just arrived," she said, placing a narrow envelope in front of Holmes. "There's no address. Just your name written in the strangest little hand." Holmes took it carefully. The envelope was sealed with red wax. No symbol, only the pressure of a thumb pressed flat against it. He broke the seal and unfolded the note. No greeting, no signature. Only a single line typed in crisp black ink. Even a cracked vessel can echo, if the chamber is deep enough. He read it twice, then passed it silently to me. "A warning?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "A message." Anna stirred, her voice so soft it barely reached us. "He used to say that." I turned. "Who?" "The man who taught me the lines. The one they called the cartographer. He'd say it after I made mistakes." Holmes crossed to her. "Do you remember anything else? His voice? His habits?" She nodded slowly. "He always wore gloves, even indoors, and he smelled of ink and something bitter. Not cologne, like old flowers." Holmes knelt to meet her gaze. "Did he ever mention names?" She hesitated. "Once, I heard someone call him Mr. Gray, but they laughed when they said it, like it wasn't real." Holmes looked over at me, then rose and went straight to the shelf above the fireplace. From behind a row of monographs, he retrieved an old folder, thick with clippings, letters, and photographs. He laid it on the table and opened to a section marked Obscure Societies, Paris-London Axis. He flipped past several pages, then stopped. A photograph had been tucked inside, sepia-toned, blurred at the edges, showing 5 men in long coats standing outside a crumbling church. He tapped the second from the left. A man tall and narrow in frame, the only one with his head turned slightly from the camera, his face obscured by shadow and a tilted hat. London, 1872, Holmes said. The gathering that preceded La Voix Dormant's first disappearance. The man beside him is Auguste Lemoine, known member, confirmed deceased. But this one, he pulled a paper from beneath the photograph. A guest registry. Signed as Everett Gray. Mr. Gray, I echoed. It could be him. It is him, Holmes said, and he's resurfaced after nearly 30 years. Not as a prophet or a mystic, but as a designer of myth. Still invisible, still orchestrating belief from the margins. Tobias looked up from his book. He doesn't like to be seen. Holmes turned. You saw him clearly? Tobias shrugged. Only once. In the alley by the bookshop, he was talking to the man in the cloak, the one who ran the phonograph. Mr. Gray never raised his voice. But the other man was afraid. Holmes's expression changed. He paced the room in a slow, deliberate circle. He will never present himself openly, but he watches closely. He tests weakness in silence, then pours meaning into the cracks. I asked, then what's our next move? Holmes paused at the fire, staring into the coals. We create the one thing he cannot control, he said. A story that tells itself. No symbols, no spirals, no voices from the deep, only truth. He turned to me, eyes intense. We publish it, as a case, a factual account. Names changed, identities protected, but everything else intact, the manipulation, the ritual, the children. We give the truth to the public before he can reframe it. You expect him to respond? He'll have no choice. We began assembling the manuscript that evening. Holmes dictated, I transcribed. Tobias and Anna offered fragments, moments, phrases, faces. We reconstructed the arc of the deception from the workhouse to the salon, careful not to embellish. It was nearly midnight when Holmes finally sat back in his chair and said, That will do. I looked at the final page. It ended not with a revelation, but with a line Holmes insisted upon. He who writes in shadows forgets that the eye adjusts. We sent the manuscript anonymously to 3 journals and 1 quiet but influential publisher known for printing unclassifiable material. And then we waited. 4 days later, a parcel arrived by post. No return address. Wrapped in heavy brown paper. Inside was a single item, a compass. Beautifully wrought, its case was brass with a spiral engraved into its lid. But where the needle should have pointed north, it spun endlessly in slow, perfect circles. Beneath it, a note. Typed. 1 line. You've drawn your map. Let's see where it leads. Holmes smiled. Not with triumph, but with understanding, and turned the compass until the spinning needle faced him. The spinning needle made no sound, but it stole the room's silence all the same. Holmes held the compass flat in his palm, eyes narrowed at the graceful, stubborn whirl as though deciphering a cipher too elegant to yield. It turned and turned, never faltering, never fixing. It was not broken, and yet it pointed to nothing. Tobias leaned forward from the arm of the settee, gaze fixed. Is it supposed to do that? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then, yes. It's designed to suggest futility, but only to the unprepared. I stepped closer. What does it mean? He placed the compass on the desk gently, as if it might vanish if treated too harshly. It means he read the manuscript, and he is answering, not with threats, but with metaphor. A moving needle with no north implies a game without rules, a chase without a destination. But look closely. He tapped the casing. There's a scratch just beneath the spiral, almost imperceptible, running precisely due east. I leaned in. It was there, a faint nick, a guiding line. You think it's a clue? I don't think, Holmes said. I see. And what I see is that Mr. Gray wishes to maintain his illusion of omniscience. But he cannot resist playing fair. Not entirely. He opened a drawer and retrieved a large map of the city. With a pencil and a ruler, he aligned the eastern scratch against the edge of the compass and traced a line radiating from the center of the spiral outward. The line cut straight across central London, passing through the Temple district, over Fleet Street and terminating just barely at the edge of the river where the old decommissioned warehouses sat in shadow, half reclaimed by fog and rot. Holmes tapped the map once. Cold storage row, abandoned since 1991, officially empty, unofficially not. You believe he's there? No, Holmes replied, but something is. Something he wants us to find, or something he believes we must not. By the time we arrived at the river bank, night had fallen hard and without ceremony. The wind off the Thames was sharp, and even the stray dogs had taken shelter. Holmes carried nothing but a small oil lantern and a coil of twine in his coat pocket. I'd brought my revolver, and for once, Holmes did not object. We reached the warehouses, stone-walled relics with iron doors, their windows shattered or long boarded over. Holmes stopped at the third along the row. This one. How do you know? He didn't answer. Instead, he crouched near the threshold, examining the lock. It was old, rusted, and covered in grime. Too obviously disused. Staged, he muttered. See the scrape along the hinge? Someone opens this regularly. They've even reapplied the rust. He produced a thin set of picks from his coat and worked silently for less than a minute. The lock gave a soft click, and the door creaked open. We stepped inside, lantern first. The air was musty and dry, a surprising lack of dampness for a structure so close to the river. The floorboards beneath our boots groaned faintly, but the sound was absorbed by the dark like secrets swallowed too quickly. Holmes held the light aloft. Look. Dozens of crates, stacked along the walls. Not the kind that once held produce or ice, but books. Boxes upon boxes of slim volumes, pamphlets, and papers tied in bundles with string. Some bore foreign stamps. Others bore no markings at all. We moved closer. I lifted one lid and peered inside. The voice and the veil. Identical to the red book Tobias had mentioned. 100 copies at least in this crate alone. Holmes opened another. Inside, leaflets printed on thick paper. Each one bore the spiral symbol, stamped faintly in gray ink. Their titles varied: The Chime Before Speech, Echo of the Watcher, Spoken Maps. The authors were all pseudonyms: AMG, Cartographos, or simply Gray. These aren't relics, I said. They're being prepared. Holmes nodded. Distribution material, the apparatus of myth ready to be deployed again. What we disrupted at Marchmont was merely the trial run of the next version. These are tools of expansion, and they were meant to be hidden. He knelt at one crate that had been pried open recently, its edges marked with fresh splinters. Inside was a leather folio tied with green ribbon. Holmes undid the knot and opened it slowly. Within were dozens of handwritten sheets, densely packed with notations, symbols, and meticulously drawn diagrams. But what caught his eye immediately was a list names. Some were underlined, others crossed out, and next to each, a year, a location, and a single word, viable or failed. Tobias March, 1895. Viable, Elise 1892. Failed, Anna di 1796. Viable. There were dozens more. Holmes stood very still. This, he said, voice low and taut, is his ledger. He flipped to the final page. One name sat alone, CM 1900, TBD. He stared at the initials for a long moment. I stepped closer. You recognize them? He nodded once. It's not a child. It's a location. He turned to me, eyes lit with certainty. Cambridge manuscript. It's a code name, a collection of symbols theorized to predate Indo-European roots. Thought destroyed in the Oxford fire of '78. But what if it wasn't? He closed the folio and placed it carefully back inside the crate. Mr. Gray isn't just preparing children to speak. He's preparing a new language, one seeded with symbols, rituals, and cadence, designed to bypass logic and implant belief. A code, Watson, spoken not to convey meaning, but to shape it. I felt the chill settle in my spine. He's weaponizing language itself. Holmes turned back toward the door. We must take this to Lestrade at once. No grand arrest, no headlines. We don't burn it. We catalog it. We learn the machinery, because the spiral turns again. And the only way to stop it is to know where it's going before it begins. As we stepped into the night, I glanced once more over my shoulder into the darkness of the warehouse. And for just a breath, no more than a second, I thought I saw a figure at the far end. A man in a gray scarf standing perfectly still, but when I raised the lantern and looked again, there was nothing. Only silence. Only shadows. But the spiral, I knew, was still turning. The fog returned to Baker Street 3 days later, coiling through the gaslight like smoke from an unsolved fire. It gathered beneath the eaves and pressed against the windows as though the city itself waited, quiet, unresolved, for a verdict. Holmes sat at his desk with his fingers steepled, his eyes fixed not on the open ledger before him, but on the silence between the pages. The folio we had retrieved from the warehouse now lay fully transcribed, every name and symbol copied into his own hand. The material had been handed to Lestrade in pieces, enough to act on, not enough to panic. Scotland Yard had begun the careful process of tracing the distribution network. Arrests would follow, but not immediately. Holmes had insisted, the roots go deeper than the branches suggest. Tobias and Anna had returned to their reading that morning. In the days since their rescue, they had formed an odd, quiet kinship. Two minds once hollowed by manipulation now filling again, slowly, with something of their own choosing. And yet I could see it in Holmes. The case had not left him. "You believe he's still watching?" I said. "I know he is." Holmes rose, crossing to the fireplace. He reached up and removed the spiral compass from the mantel where it had sat since its arrival. The needle still spun, undisturbed by time or placement. But Holmes no longer watched it as a riddle. Now he held it like a mirror. "I'd thought this case to be an investigation into a child's disappearance," he said. "Then I believed it was an exposure of fraud, then a conspiracy. But it was always something more, something slower." He turned to me. "Language, Watson, that's what he hunts. Not words, but language itself. Not thought, but the rhythm beneath it. He uses belief like mortar, symbols like bricks, and children, those most open to repetition, as the scaffolding." I nodded. "And yet it was the children who helped break the pattern." "Yes," Holmes said softly. "Because the one thing he cannot account for is unpredictable kindness. We disrupted the ritual, not with force, but by giving his instruments a choice. That is what cracked his illusion." At that moment there came a knock. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a parcel wrapped in linen. "This just came, Mr. Holmes. Left by hand. No messenger." Holmes took it gently. The linen had been folded with precision, no wax seal this time. Just a simple note pinned with a bone button. He unfolded it. "You did not end the pattern. You only made it visible. That is enough. For now." There was no name. There never had been. Inside the cloth, a single stone, black, flat, polished to a mirror sheen. Holmes held it to the light. On its surface, etched faintly but unmistakably, was the spiral, and beneath it, a fracture, a fine hairline crack. He placed the stone carefully on the mantel beside the compass and stepped back. "Well," he said after a long pause, we have our answer. Which is that he's not finished. He turned toward the fire. But neither are we. I crossed the room and sat opposite him, pulling out the final set of notes from the case, the full chronicle I had prepared. Not for publication, not this time, not yet, but for the record, for the next mind who might need to read it. Holmes did not stop me. Instead, he lit his pipe and glanced toward the hearth where the spiral and the children's names had once been chalked and erased, and said, "Watson, the work of the rational man is not to silence myth, but to disarm it. And when myth returns, as it always does, we meet it not with fear, but with light." And for once, I believed him, because even a cracked vessel, I had come to learn, could still echo, but it needn't echo him. It could echo us. 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 It could